Hello and welcome to another podcast. Now, this podcast is part two of a little mini series, I suppose, that I've been doing about why photographs can appear out of focus. So the first part was to talk about the camera system, what's going on mechanically with your camera, and where you might get situations that certainly throw off the autofocus and how to get the most from your autofocus system. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about how your eyes and your brain can add to the confusion and what goes on when you take a photograph using RAW. So that's the what we'll be covering. What are we talking about in this podcast? So if you find these useful, please give me a like and subscribe. That helps me to carry on doing what I'm doing. So let's dive in. First of all, how does our eye and our brain work? So this is the other system that we have running when we're looking at things. So any camera, you might have heard the phrase, the most important part of any camera system is the 9 inches, whatever it is, behind the viewfinder. So in other words, your brain. And I think that's very true. However, it can play tricks on you. So over time, when we're learning to identify things, obviously early on in our lives, we kind of decide for ourselves what sharp looks like. And basically, it comes down to strong contrast at the edges of things, and where we can clearly make out details. So they might be pores in the skin, could be fabric in a fabric weave in a carpet or something like that, hair strands, all these kinds of things. And we like to see a clear difference in lighting. All of this adds to the contrast. And this might sound familiar to what I was talking about in the autofocus system. So there's obviously a parallel there. And, it makes a lot of sense that it would be when you think about it. So that's the first place where we can have, and it's probably why you may have experienced that situation where you've taken a really nice photograph, but when you look at it, when you get home, it looks really soft and you can't understand why. And you're a bit frustrated because everything was good. Now, the other element to this could also be, and this can add to the frustration, is that when you checked that image after you took it, you looked on the back of your camera, the display in the camera, the image looked really good. It looked sharp. It looked, well lit, all of that kind of thing. So what's going on there? Well, there's a couple of things you need to understand. So the first thing, which I've really covered at least as much as I want to without going into some deep dive, which is probably a bit irrelevant, it's our visual system is looking for good contrast. That's the key thing we're looking for to start with. The other thing, and the image that appears on the back of the camera, what you need to understand is, and this will depend on your camera, but the chances are highly likely that you're not looking at the RAW file that you'll be looking at on your computer when you get it home. And that's because you're probably looking at a JPEG that the camera computer has generated so that you can see what's going on. So what happens there? Well, again, two things to understand. What are these two files? So a RAW file, first of all, is not a photograph. So that's an important thing to understand. A RAW file is not a photograph. It is data that contains the information that will make up that photograph, but it is not the photograph. And if you think about it, we never print out RAW files. I send stuff to a printer. I never send RAW files. I actually send in JPEGs, really big JPEGs. And social media, it's JPEGs. And even when you're saving, if you use something like Photoshop, and I'm assuming Lightroom is the same, you don't save the RAW file. You actually save it in another format. So typically a TIFF or a JPEG or something else. So what you're looking at in the RAW file is not actually the photograph itself. What you're looking at in a JPEG is a photograph. And what's happened? What's the difference? Well, the first thing with a JPEG, which sort of has less bearing on the sharpness of it, but it's important to just understand if you don't understand what a JPEG is, it's a compressed file. So it's compressed primarily to make the file size much, much smaller than the original file that you captured on the camera. And there's a couple of places where that's really important. One is to reduce the storage space that you need on the camera, particularly important in the early digital cameras because there wasn't so much memory. So you could easily run out of memory on those cameras. Today, with the kind of memory capacities we have these days, it's not so much of an issue. That's certainly one aspect of it. The second is when you are using images on social media, on websites, anywhere where they need to be downloaded and downloaded quickly. If you've got a smaller file, obviously that will happen much faster. And again, if you go back to the early days of the internet, this was really important. But even today, if you're using files on a website, people don't want to wait 15, 20 seconds for your image to download. They'll be long gone by the time that image has finished downloading. So this is where you'll use a JPEG. So JPEG's pretty universal. But how do you get that image? What happens? Well, essentially, to get from the raw file to the JPEG, what the computer and the camera does to give you that little image is it sharpens that image, it boosts the contrast, it will increase the clarity or the contrast in these micro elements, hair strands, that kind of thing. It reduces the noise in the image, and I won't go into noise in this particular podcast, and it will enhance the color. So all of this is done automatically for you within the camera. It's obviously done very quickly. And that's why when you take a shot, it can look pretty amazing on the back of your camera. But then when you go to look at it on a laptop, when you access the raw file, it looks very different. It looks, in fact, it will look very flat. The contrast will be low. It won't look as crisp. It could even look a little bit out of focus. So how do we deal with that? Well, the first thing to remember is that raw files need to be post-processed, and that's why post-processing an image is a fundamental part of photography. If you are doing, I'm going to say anything, certainly professionally, but even if it's semi-professional, or even if you're a pretty committed hobbyist, unless you're just taking JPEG straight off the back of the camera, if you're doing snaps, basically, I mean, this is like snapshots, to use an old term. If you're using anything other than that, I recommend that you always shoot in RAW, because that way you've got all of the information that the camera was able to capture on that particular scene, and then you post-process it. So you need to post-process because the data that's captured is, as I've said, not a photograph. And what you actually have is you have data for different colors, so red, green, blue, your RGBs, and there are other things that are captured in the file. So again, it's not important to dive into the detail on this. There's lots of information there if you really want to know more. But essentially, what you're looking at is not a photograph. So that's what we do when we go into post-processing. You may also have distortions introduced by the lens. So there might be chromatic aberrations, so the differences in the way different wavelengths of light are handled within the lens, vignetting, distortion, possibly losing some definition at the edges if it's a low quality lens, all that kind of thing. So I use Photoshop, so I'm more familiar with that. What you're using may not give you the same thing. One of the things in Photoshop that I use is a lens profile. So in the metadata that's stored with the photograph file by the camera, usually that will include, so it will have things like shutter speed, aperture, ISO, all that kind of thing. Usually you'll have the camera itself, the information on the camera, so which camera it was taken on, also the lens. And Photoshop has lens profiles. So if you apply those, it will apply a correction to the photograph to correct for any distortions that lens is known to introduce. And if it's a zoom lens, distortions that happen at particular focal lengths, because the focal length on a zoom lens will also be in that metadata. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. And that's part of the reason why things don't look right. But the key thing to focus on when you're in the post-production phase, when you're editing, and I guess I'll talk you through my process very quickly, because I don't spend a lot of time on most images. Most of them, if I spend more than a couple of minutes on an image, then that's a lot for me. So what I do, I go into the raw editor in Photoshop, and you'll have similar. You'll be able to do similar things in whatever you're using, but you're accessing the raw file. First thing I do is I tend to reduce the color to an absolute minimum, because what I'm interested in, first off, is the contrast. And this is where you can get rid of that flatness in the image. So I'll always work with the sliders. I use curve. And essentially what you can do is you control the different aspects of the light parts of the image and the dark parts. So darkness, shadows, that kind of thing, highlights, general lighting on the bright side. And I'll work with those, and I tend to use more or less the same settings. I don't have a particular profile that I use, but they end up with a particular look that I like. And for me, I stop adjusting when the image kind of pops, is the only way I can describe it, but it's where it comes out of the screen a little bit. It starts to feel three-dimensional. And this is where my brain is interpreting what I'm seeing. And so something that looks good to me might look pretty awful to you. You never know. But this is where this sort of eye-brain combination works as well. So I'm doing this visually. I'm applying judgment. As I say, I don't apply a standard adjustment. I do it all based on my feel and what I like. But I'm looking for something that, to me, looks three-dimensional. I can start to sense depth. I can begin to see contrast. The sharpness is increasing. So that's phase one. And that's the main phase of what I do. And then I'll add the color back in. And just a note on that, I might over-saturize a tad, but not very much, because I tend to look for things like grass and get the color of the grass about right, because most of us can see grass at some point. But even if we don't know what a tiger looks like in the wild, we haven't seen them personally, we do know what grass looks like. So that gives you a feel, whether it's conscious or subconscious, about just how real that image is. I think most of us can. I've looked at competition photographs, and a lot of them I know are saturated a little bit more than is real, but it creates a more compelling image. And why not? We're artists as well as photographers. So that's the first thing. The next thing to look at is just to work on the edges. So where we get good contrast, and this applied to the autofocus stuff as well, you're really looking for good contrast on the edges of elements within the photograph. So it could be a hair, if it's portrait. It could be a rock, if it's landscape. But we're looking for increased contrast. And where we apply that, and I'm going to talk about really what I do in Photoshop, and I deliberately don't talk a lot about post-processing packages, partly because I don't have a wide variety of experience with them. As I say, I've tended to use Photoshop for a long time. But also, if you go through how-to videos, I find the user interfaces change periodically, so your video is immediately out of date. So I don't go into those. But the kind of thing I'm looking at is, first of all, texture. So there is, I think it's an enhance menu, but it's texture. And that allows you to increase or reduce the texture in the image. And it works like sharpening. So again, there are programs out there like Sharpen AI from Topaz Labs. So I use that one as well. And what they're doing is they're looking at differences in shape and color. So things that allow you to identify what a hair is or what an eye is or whatever it might be. And it just sharpens the edges. Now, clarity is another setting that I use in Photoshop, and that just changes the contrast around the edges. And what you're also doing with that is changing the radius. Now, I know in Lightroom it works slightly differently. You've got a sharpening function and a radius function. So sharpening will, again, sharpen the contrast on those edges. The radius determines how broad that sharpening edge is. So if you've got a narrow radius, it won't be very much. As you increase that, obviously it gets wider. And there are different settings there, like detail and things like that. But essentially, what you're looking for are the tools within the editor that you use to just work on sharpening those edges so that they become crisper. And the crisper they are, the sharper the whole image looks, and suddenly things look to be really in focus. If you've got these options in the editor that you're using and you haven't used them before, I do recommend having a go. Maybe find a tutorial. There's lots of tutorials there anyway, so I'm not going to. I don't have those myself. I concentrate more on the photography part, actually acquiring the image, and you'll get that from my course. But do understand them and do experiment with them. And I think the basic tip here is not to go mad with them. Don't over edit. Keep the changes fairly small, fairly subtle, because then you can get into all sorts of problems, like you start getting haloing around images and things like that. Things start to look over-processed is a phrase that gets used. They're over-edited. And what that means is that the people, whoever's been doing that work, has gone too far with these adjustments. So keep them to a minimum. And what you'll find is that just making fairly small changes can have a big impact. It can just make that difference between an image looking flat and an image looking sharp. And that's what we're really going for. So the important thing to note is that when you acquired the image originally, there was nothing wrong with your settings. You've got the focus correct. You might have been on a tripod, for example, if you're doing a landscape. Nothing moved. Your shutter speed was fine. Everything was good. But because you took that photograph on a dull day, on an overcast day where the contrast was quite low, or you're shooting in the blue hour, or you're some other time where you haven't got a lot of light, where the contrast levels are low, you can expect that you might have to do a little bit or pay a little bit more attention in your post-processing to bring that image out, to make it a bit sharper. So look, I'm going to leave this podcast there. I hope you found that interesting. Maybe it's explained why you have been in that frustrating situation. And until I understood this, I was in exactly the same boat. I kept looking at what I was doing on the camera. I knew that was all good. All my settings were good. I was shooting really fast. I remember doing this with whales actually early on. They were just coming out. They didn't look right at all, and I couldn't understand what was going on. And I was using really fast settings to absolutely freeze the action. But because it was a bit overcast and I hadn't made that connection, it just looked wrong to me, and I couldn't get what it was. So if you have experienced that, or if you are experiencing that, then have a go. Go back to an image that you've shot that looked wrong. Hopefully you haven't deleted it. Pop it in an editor and just try doing a little bit of sharpening. Just work on the contrast, bring the contrast up a little bit. If you're not sure how to do it, bring up a tutorial just to take you through those steps. And you may well have an image that becomes a favorite. And that's absolutely true for one of mine that was a favorite. It was actually a whale. It wasn't anything that special, to be perfectly honest. It was a whale swimming, but I had some cliffs in the background. It was flute up a little bit. It was about to bring its flute right up, but it'd come out of the water, and the flute was pretty much horizontal at this point, but water was running off it still. And there was a little bit of sort of grey from the blow that had drifted over where the tail was. And I remember initially looking at it and being really disappointed with this shot. I just thought, yeah, that's, I almost deleted it, but I didn't. And then I went back to it a few months later and could see the potential and just reworked it. And suddenly it just popped out and it became an image that I really love. And it's on one of my platforms. If you go to the different platforms I have where I've got different things going on. So enough of that, though. That's it for this podcast. If you feel I've earned it, please give me a like and subscribe. Please visit the website. Please take a look at the photography course if you want to give that a go. I recommend it. It starts assuming nothing and takes you through all of the essential blocks and not only explains things, but gives you active exercises to do, because photography is not a spectator sport. So you need to be out there doing it. Okay. Thank you so much. I will speak to you next time. Bye for now. Oh, and just one more thing before you go. Just remember to drop any comments that you have or questions, and I'll get back to them in a future podcast. And remember that there's a new podcast every Friday. So if you've enjoyed this one, please remember to like and subscribe and join me on my mailing list, and you'll get a heads up about the latest podcast. So bye for now.